The moment you decide someone is beneath you may be the exact moment they save you from your greatest mistake. The private dining room on the top floor of the Hawthorne Hotel had become so quiet that even the soft ticking of the antique wall clock sounded painfully loud. 12 executives stared at a conference table covered with contracts, financial projections, laptops, and half-finished cups of coffee that had long gone cold. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to breathe too loudly. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the table with his suit jacket draped over one shoulder, his tie loosened, and frustration written across every line of his face. He had built a multi-billion-dollar investment empire by making decisions faster than anyone else in the room. Today, for the first time in years, every expert he had hired seemed completely useless. His chief financial officer adjusted his glasses for the fourth time in 5 minutes. The lead attorney flipped through another stack of documents without finding the answer Ethan demanded. 2 outside consultants whispered to each other, hoping one of them would notice something the others had missed. No one did. Ethan slammed the folder onto the polished walnut table, making several coffee cups rattle. "Bring me someone smarter," he barked. The words echoed across the room before disappearing into an uncomfortable silence. Outside the glass walls, dinner service continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Waiters carried elegant plates. Guests laughed over expensive wine. A jazz piano drifted through hidden speakers. Life moved on while millions of dollars sat frozen inside one unanswered question. Claire Bennett had no intention of becoming part of that moment. She was simply delivering fresh coffee after another server had called in sick. 27 years old, wearing a crisp white shirt beneath a black apron, she walked with the calm efficiency that came from working double shifts for nearly 3 years. She lowered the silver coffee pot without interrupting anyone. One executive held out his cup without looking at her. Another continued staring at his spreadsheet. Ethan never even noticed she had entered the room. Claire quietly refilled one cup after another until she reached the thick financial binder lying open beside Ethan's laptop. She wasn't trying to read it. One page simply caught her eye while she waited for another cup to fill. A single chart. 3 highlighted percentages. One assumption circled in blue ink. Her hand paused for less than a second. Her eyes moved across the numbers once. Then twice. Something felt wrong. Not complicated wrong. Simple wrong. The kind of mistake that hid in plain sight because everyone assumed someone else had already checked it. She looked away immediately and continued pouring coffee. She should have walked out. It wasn't her meeting. It wasn't her business. She was only the waitress. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face before looking toward his exhausted advisors again. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice sharp but controlled. "I pay the best people in the country and nobody can explain why this acquisition suddenly stopped making sense." No one answered. Claire reached the end of the table. She placed the coffee pot onto the serving tray and took one small step toward the door. Then she stopped. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Her grandmother had once told her that silence protects peace, but silence also protects mistakes. She turned back slowly. "Sir?" she said so quietly that only the nearest executive heard her. Nobody reacted. Claire spoke once more, still calm, almost apologetic. "I think everyone may be checking the wrong assumption." Every head turned toward her at once. Ethan stared at the young waitress as though he had only just realized she existed. Confusion replaced irritation for a single heartbeat. Then disbelief settled across the room. One attorney actually laughed under his breath. The CFO folded his arms. Ethan's expression hardened. "Excuse me." Claire didn't move closer. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the chart one last time. "If I'm mistaken, please ignore me," she said. But if that growth rate was copied from last year's regional model instead of this quarter's national forecast, she pointed gently toward one line on the page without touching the binder. Then the rest of the valuation changes immediately. Silence returned. Only this time, it sounded completely different. No one reached for the binder. No one challenged her calculation. They simply stared at the young waitress standing beside a silver coffee pot as though the room had quietly shifted beneath their feet. Ethan Caldwell followed the direction of her finger until his eyes settled on the single line she had indicated. His jaw tightened. He picked up the binder himself, flipping back 3 pages, then forward again, comparing charts with the speed of a man who had spent 2 decades reading financial reports before sunrise. The confidence on his face slowly gave way to concentration. Around the table, laptop screens came alive as analysts hurried to verify the numbers she had mentioned. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Formulas refreshed. Columns changed. Percentages adjusted. The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was focused. Claire remained exactly where she was. She did not step closer. She did not attempt to explain further. She simply waited with both hands resting lightly on the serving tray. One of the senior analysts suddenly leaned forward until his glasses nearly touched the screen. His breathing slowed. Then he whispered almost to himself, "Run the model again using the national forecast." Another analyst repeated the instruction. Seconds later, a different spreadsheet appeared. The projected earnings changed immediately. So did the acquisition value. The room collectively inhaled. The difference was not small. It transformed the entire transaction. Ethan took one slow step toward the display without taking his eyes off the revised numbers. His chief financial officer looked visibly unsettled. "That cannot be right," he murmured, opening another file. He checked the source documents. Then another. Finally, he closed his laptop halfway and leaned back in his chair. "It is right," he admitted quietly. The regional growth assumption was imported into the national valuation model 3 days ago. Nobody spoke after that. They did not need to. The answer had been sitting inside the binder the entire afternoon. 12 experienced professionals had looked directly at it without seeing what one waitress had noticed while pouring coffee. Ethan turned toward Claire for the first time without impatience in his eyes. Instead, there was something unfamiliar. Curiosity. "How did you see that?" he asked. Claire offered a small, respectful smile. "The percentages did not match the trend on the previous page," she answered. When numbers tell different stories, one of them is usually standing in the wrong place. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. The explanation sounded almost too simple. Ethan studied her expression, searching for hesitation, for arrogance, for the satisfaction that often followed proving powerful people wrong. He found none of those things. She looked exactly as she had 5 minutes earlier. Calm, professional, ready to leave if no one needed more coffee. "Have we met before?" Ethan asked. Claire shook her head. "No, sir. Do you have a background in finance?" Before she could answer, the restaurant manager hurried into the room after hearing rumors from the staff outside. His face carried the nervous smile of someone expecting an apology before he even understood the problem. "Mr. Caldwell, I sincerely apologize if there has been any interruption during your meeting." Ethan did not look away from Claire. "Your waitress just prevented my company from making a very expensive mistake." The manager blinked twice. "Claire?" he asked in disbelief. "She has worked here for almost 3 years." Ethan glanced briefly toward the coffee tray still resting in her hands. "Apparently, she has been doing more than serving coffee." Claire lowered her eyes politely. "I only noticed something that seemed unusual." "Most people would have kept walking," Ethan replied. "Most people would have assumed it was none of their business." Claire answered softly. "Sometimes it is easier to stay quiet. But staying quiet does not always help the people around us." Her words settled over the room with unexpected weight. No one laughed. No one dismissed her. Outside the conference room, dishes clinked gently against porcelain. Conversations drifted through the dining room, and the evening carried on exactly as before. Yet inside those glass walls, the balance had shifted in a way no contract could measure. For the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell closed the binder instead of opening another one. He looked directly at Claire Bennett, not as a waitress standing beside a coffee pot, but as someone whose quiet observation had accomplished what an entire room of celebrated experts had failed to do. Claire expected the conversation to end there. She assumed someone would thank her politely, another server would collect the empty coffee pot, and the evening would continue exactly as every other shift had. Instead, Ethan Caldwell remained standing, his attention fixed on the woman who had quietly changed the direction of an acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Around the table, the executives no longer looked at Claire as though she were invisible. They studied her with the cautious curiosity usually reserved for unexpected opportunities or unanswered questions. Ethan slowly pulled out the chair beside him. "Please," he said, "sit down for a moment." Claire hesitated. She glanced toward the dining room beyond the glass walls where guests continued enjoying their meals beneath warm chandeliers. Other servers moved gracefully between tables carrying polished silver trays. She could already imagine her manager wondering why she had disappeared during the busiest hour of dinner service. "I should get back to work," she answered gently. Ethan nodded once. "5 minutes. I promise." Before Claire could respond, the restaurant manager spoke first. "It is all right, Claire. I will cover your section." His voice carried more respect than she had ever heard directed toward her before. She carefully set the coffee tray aside and took the offered seat. It felt strangely unfamiliar. Just moments earlier, she had been standing quietly beside the wall. Now 12 senior executives watched her as though she were presenting the quarterly report herself. Ethan folded his hands together. "You recognized a valuation error almost instantly. That is not normal. Tell me honestly, where did you learn to analyze financial models?" Claire smiled. Politely, but there was no pride behind the expression. "I did not study this exact model," she replied. "Numbers simply tend to reveal patterns if you spend enough time listening to them." One executive frowned with genuine confusion. "Listening?" Claire nodded. "Every spreadsheet tells a story. Revenue, costs, projections, assumptions. When one page begins telling a different story than the page before it, I usually look for the reason." The chief financial officer leaned forward. "That is exactly how our senior analysts are trained." Claire offered a small shrug. "Perhaps. I have never met one." Ethan noticed the answer immediately. She had not claimed expertise. She had not attempted to impress anyone. She simply described the way she thought. That made her even more interesting. "Did you attend college?" he asked. Claire paused just long enough for the room to notice. "Yes." "Business school?" "No, economics." She shook her head. "Applied mathematics." Several executives exchanged surprised looks. Ethan remained perfectly still. "Which university?" Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Northwestern." Silence settled over the room once again. One of the consultants quietly whispered, "That is one of the strongest mathematics programs in the country." Ethan looked directly at her. "Then why are you working here?" It was not an insulting question. This time it sounded sincere. Claire rested both hands comfortably in her lap before speaking. "Because life does not always continue in the direction we planned." Nobody interrupted. She continued in the same calm voice. "During my final year, my mother became seriously ill. She needed full-time care. My father had already passed away several years earlier. Tuition became impossible. Hospital bills became more important than graduate school." She smiled softly, almost as though she were describing someone else's story. "The restaurant hired me the week after I withdrew." No one at the table spoke. Outside the conference room, a waiter laughed with a family celebrating a birthday. A little girl pointed excitedly toward a dessert cart rolling across the dining room. The ordinary rhythm of life continued only a few feet away, making the quiet inside the room feel even deeper. Ethan studied Claire with growing respect. He had spent years believing talent naturally rose to the top. Yet the woman sitting across from him quietly proved something he had never considered. Sometimes talent simply stopped climbing because responsibility weighed more than ambition. Ethan glanced toward the financial binder resting on the table before looking back at Claire. "You walked away from a remarkable future," he said quietly. Claire answered with the same peaceful certainty that had marked every sentence she had spoken that evening. "No," she replied. "I only postponed one future so someone I loved could have another." For reasons Ethan could not fully explain, those words stayed with him far longer than the corrected numbers ever would. The room remained quiet long after Claire finished speaking. No presentation filled the silence. No one hurried to change the subject. For men and women who measured nearly everything in percentages, quarterly reports, and market trends, her explanation had introduced something no spreadsheet could calculate. Sacrifice rarely appeared on a balance sheet, yet it often shaped the lives behind every number. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair, his attention never leaving Claire. During countless negotiations, he had learned to recognize confidence, exaggeration, manipulation, and ambition within the first few minutes of a conversation. What he saw in front of him belonged to none of those categories. Claire answered every question without trying to impress anyone. She never spoke longer than necessary. She never raised her voice. She never looked around the room, searching for approval. It was as though she had spent years becoming comfortable with not being noticed. One of the younger analysts finally broke the silence. If you completed 3 years of applied mathematics, why not work remotely or consult somewhere? You could probably earn several times what you make here. Claire smiled politely. Perhaps. The analyst waited for more. None came. Ethan noticed the unfinished answer. There is another reason, he said quietly. Claire hesitated before nodding once. My mother's treatments became more frequent. Restaurants offered flexible shifts. Most corporate jobs did not. The restaurant manager looked genuinely surprised. He had worked beside Claire for nearly 3 years, yet he had never heard the full story. He suddenly realized that the employee who never complained, never arrived late, and always volunteered for extra shifts had quietly been carrying responsibilities no one else had bothered to ask about. Ethan glanced toward the conference room windows. Beyond the glass, Claire's co-workers continued serving guests. Some laughed together while arranging dessert plates. Others hurried between tables, balancing trays with practiced precision. Every one of them had a story. He wondered how many remarkable people he had passed without ever looking beyond a uniform. His thoughts were interrupted by the chief financial officer. Mr. Caldwell, he said carefully, the revised valuation has already been confirmed by our New York office. If we had signed tonight, the pricing error would have cost us far more than we originally estimated. Ethan nodded slowly. How much? The answer came after only a brief calculation. Approximately $42 million over the first 18 months. Nobody reacted dramatically. They simply absorbed the number. $42 million. Saved by a waitress carrying a silver coffee pot. Ethan looked back at Claire. Do you realize what you prevented tonight? Claire answered without hesitation. I prevented a mistake. The size of the mistake belongs to your company, not to me. Once again, the simplicity of her words seemed larger than the sentence itself. Ethan found himself smiling almost imperceptibly. It had been years since someone answered him without calculation. Tell me something else, he said. When I demanded someone smarter, were you offended? Claire considered the question honestly. No, Ethan raised an eyebrow. Not even a little? She shook her head gently. People usually speak from pressure before they speak from character. You were frustrated because something important was slipping away. I listened to the problem instead of the volume. Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. The sentence lingered in the room long after Claire finished speaking. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Few people had ever answered him with such grace after hearing him lose his temper. He realized that while everyone else had been trying to solve the financial problem, Claire had quietly solved something much less visible. She had refused to let his worst moment become her opinion of him. The restaurant manager discreetly checked his watch. Dinner service was reaching its busiest hour. Claire noticed before anyone else. She stood carefully from her chair. Thank you for allowing me to explain, she said warmly. I should return to my tables now. Guests have been waiting longer than they should. Ethan did not stop her immediately. Instead, he watched as she reached for the silver coffee pot exactly where she had left it. The same tray, the same uniform, the same calm expression. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had just changed the outcome of a corporate decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As Claire walked toward the conference room door, Ethan suddenly understood something that had never crossed his mind during decades of success. Intelligence often entered a room without introducing itself, and dignity rarely announced its own value. Those who carried both usually left the deepest impression without ever trying to do so. Claire had almost reached the door when Ethan's voice stopped her once more. It was different now. The sharp edge that had filled the room earlier had disappeared, replaced by a calm that surprised even his own executives. Miss Bennett. She turned politely. Yes, sir. Ethan walked around the conference table instead of speaking from the head of it. The movement itself caught everyone's attention. People who worked with him knew he rarely left his position during important meetings. Tonight, however, the numbers no longer seemed like the most important thing in the room. He stopped a respectful distance from Claire. Would you allow me to ask one more question? She nodded. Of course. Ethan glanced briefly at the corrected financial model, still displayed across several laptop screens. If you had been sitting in my chair tonight, what would you have done after discovering this mistake? Several executives instinctively reached for their notebooks. The question was no longer about mathematics. It was about judgment. Claire looked toward the glowing spreadsheets for only a moment before answering. I would postpone the acquisition until every assumption could be verified independently. The chief financial officer nodded almost immediately. That is exactly what we should do. Claire continued. And tomorrow morning I would ask why 12 intelligent people missed something so simple. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. Ethan folded his arms. What answer would you expect? Claire did not hesitate. Probably the wrong one. Ethan seemed intrigued. Explain. Claire looked around the conference room before speaking carefully. People often believe mistakes happen because someone lacks intelligence. Most of the time they happen because everyone trusts the same assumption. When experienced people agree too quickly, they sometimes stop questioning what they already believe. The room became remarkably still. Those words carried no criticism. They sounded more like an observation someone had quietly collected over many years. Ethan slowly nodded to himself. Group thinking, one consultant murmured. Claire smiled gently. Something like that. Ethan looked toward his executives. How many of us questioned the original growth forecast? No hands moved. No voices answered. Finally, the chief financial officer admitted, none of us. We trusted the source because we trusted each other. Claire lowered her eyes respectfully. Trust is valuable. Verification protects trust. Ethan repeated the sentence almost under his breath, allowing each word to settle. Verification protects trust. He realized those 3 words described leadership more accurately than dozens of management books sitting on the shelves in his office. The restaurant manager quietly approached the doorway. Claire, your tables have been covered, but your guests have been asking for you. Claire nodded gratefully. Thank you. She picked up the silver coffee pot once again. Ethan noticed the familiar movement. Despite everything that had happened during the past 20 minutes, she returned naturally to the work she had come to do. There was no expectation of recognition, no request for praise, no attempt to remain at the center of attention. She simply resumed serving others. Before she reached the door, Ethan spoke one final time. Miss Bennett. She turned once more. Thank you. The words were simple, yet every executive in the room understood how unusual they were. Ethan Caldwell thanked people when deals closed successfully. He thanked investors after profitable negotiations. Rarely did he thank someone for correcting him. Claire answered with the same quiet grace she had shown all evening. You are welcome, sir. Then she walked back into the dining room. Warm light reflected across polished glass. Soft piano music floated through the restaurant. Guests continued celebrating anniversaries, business dinners, birthdays, and ordinary evenings that would soon become memories. Claire moved from table to table exactly as she had before entering the conference room, greeting every guest with the same gentle smile. Watching through the glass, Ethan found it almost impossible to reconcile what he had just witnessed. The woman who had calmly redirected a $42 million decision was now recommending desserts and refilling water glasses with exactly the same care she had given to every conversation that night. For the first time in many years, Ethan understood that greatness was not always revealed by the position someone held. Sometimes it revealed itself in the consistency with which they treated every responsibility, no matter how ordinary it appeared. The conference room slowly emptied, but Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows long after his executives carried their laptops into the hallway. The corrected financial reports had already been forwarded to his headquarters in New York. Conference calls had been scheduled for early the next morning. The acquisition had been postponed. Every practical problem now had a solution. Yet his attention kept returning to the dining room below. Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables with the same steady rhythm she had shown throughout the evening. She greeted an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary with genuine warmth. She patiently explained the menu to a family visiting from out of town. She laughed softly when a young boy proudly announced that he had ordered his first steak. There was no difference in the way she treated people. The businessman wearing an expensive watch received the same kindness as the retired schoolteacher. The family sharing one dessert received the same respect as the guests ordering the most expensive bottles of wine. Ethan found himself watching something he had rarely noticed before. Character looked remarkably consistent when no one believed they were being observed. His chief financial officer stepped back into the room carrying a tablet. The revised projections have been confirmed again, he said. Every independent review matches Miss Bennett's observation. Ethan accepted the tablet without looking at it. How many interviews did we conduct before hiring our senior analysts? Hundreds. Background checks. Every candidate. Ethan nodded slowly. And yet the person who identified the most expensive mistake tonight was never part of our search. The chief financial officer smiled thoughtfully. Sometimes the best talent is not looking for us. Ethan remained silent for a moment. Then he asked a question that surprised even himself. What do we know about Claire Bennett besides what she told us? Almost nothing. Ethan looked through the glass once again. Find out only what she would be comfortable telling us herself. I do not want investigators searching through her private life. The chief financial officer looked mildly surprised. Ethan was known for conducting exhaustive research before every major decision. Tonight, however, he had drawn an unexpected line between curiosity and respect. Understood, he replied before leaving quietly. Ethan stayed alone for several more minutes. He remembered the exact words Claire had spoken. People often speak from pressure before they speak from character. He had replayed that sentence repeatedly in his mind. For years he had excused his temper as the unavoidable cost of success. Deadlines, investors, responsibility, pressure. Yet one woman carrying a coffee pot had responded to his frustration with more composure than he had shown in his own meeting. That realization unsettled him far more than the accounting error ever had. Down in the dining room, Claire collected empty plates from a corner table where 3 nurses had just finished dinner after a long hospital shift. One of them thanked her for remembering that she preferred lemon in her iced tea without being asked. Claire smiled and quietly wished them a peaceful evening before returning to the service station. Her coworkers spoke easily with her. One server asked for help balancing a crowded tray. Another requested assistance with a large family celebrating a birthday. Claire never hesitated. She simply helped wherever she was needed before returning to her own responsibilities. Nobody there seemed aware that she had quietly altered the course of a major corporate decision less than an hour earlier. Ethan watched the scene with growing admiration. Success had introduced him to brilliant people throughout his career, but brilliance often arrived demanding recognition. Claire appeared to possess something rarer. She contributed without seeking attention and solved problems without expecting reward. As the pianist began playing a slower melody near the center of the restaurant, Ethan realized that the evening had challenged more than his business judgment. It had quietly exposed an assumption he had carried for years without questioning. He had always believed extraordinary people announced themselves through impressive titles, prestigious offices, or influential positions. Tonight, a waitress had demonstrated that extraordinary people sometimes wore ordinary uniforms, and the only reason they remained unnoticed was because too many people had forgotten to look closely. The dinner crowd gradually thinned as the evening settled into a quieter rhythm. Candles burned lower on the tables, conversations softened into gentle murmurs, and the piano player shifted from lively jazz to slower melodies that floated through the restaurant like warm evening light. Claire Bennett finished clearing a table near the windows before carrying a stack of neatly folded linen napkins back toward the service station. She moved with the same quiet confidence she had shown since the beginning of her shift, never rushing, never wasting a movement. To everyone around her, she was simply another hard-working waitress finishing another busy evening. Only one person in the building now understood that there was much more behind that calm smile. Ethan Caldwell finally left the conference room and stepped into the dining area without the usual circle of executives surrounding him. The expensive suit, the polished shoes, and the unmistakable presence that often caused people to stand a little straighter remained exactly the same. Yet something else had changed. He was observing instead of commanding, listening instead of directing. For perhaps the first time in years, he was allowing himself to notice details that money could never purchase. Claire stopped beside an elderly gentleman who was dining alone. She noticed his coffee cup had become empty before he asked for another refill. She quietly warmed the porcelain cup with fresh coffee, then placed 2 packets of sweetener beside his saucer without saying a word. The gentleman smiled with pleasant surprise. You remembered. Claire returned the smile. You visit every Thursday. I thought you might enjoy it the same way tonight. Ethan watched the brief exchange from several tables away. It lasted less than 15 seconds, yet it revealed more about Claire than any resume ever could. She paid attention, not because someone rewarded her for it, but because she believed people deserved to feel seen. As she continued toward another table, one of the younger servers accidentally dropped a spoon onto the floor while balancing several dessert plates. Before anyone else reacted, Claire calmly stepped beside her coworker, steadied the tray with one hand, picked up the fallen utensil with the other, and quietly disappeared into the kitchen to replace it. The entire exchange happened so naturally that most guests never noticed. Ethan did. He realized she solved ordinary problems with exactly the same calm focus she had used to solve an extraordinary one. There was no difference in her attitude. Only the size of the problem changed. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager approached Ethan with a grateful smile. "Mr. Caldwell, I hope everything has been resolved to your satisfaction." Ethan nodded. "More than you realize." The manager glanced toward Claire, who was carefully helping a young couple celebrate their engagement by arranging a small dessert with a candle in the center. "She has always been like that," he said quietly. "She notices things before anyone else does. If a customer seems worried, she remembers. If another employee needs help, she somehow arrives before they ask. We all depend on her more than she probably knows." Ethan listened without interrupting. "Has she ever asked for a promotion?" "Never." "Higher pay?" The manager smiled faintly. "Only enough flexibility to take her mother to medical appointments. She has never negotiated for herself." Ethan remained silent. Throughout his career, he had met brilliant negotiators who fought fiercely for larger contracts, better offices, and greater authority. Claire, despite possessing remarkable ability, had spent years negotiating only for enough time to care for someone else. That thought settled heavily in his mind. At that moment, Claire turned and noticed Ethan standing nearby. She offered the same warm, professional smile she gave every guest. No hesitation, no expectation, no reminder of what had happened in the conference room. To her, he was simply another customer whose evening mattered. Ethan returned the smile with genuine respect. He suddenly understood why the atmosphere around her always seemed calmer. Claire never entered a room asking people to recognize her value. She entered asking how she could make someone else's day a little easier. In a world where so many people measured success by being noticed first, she quietly measured it by leaving every person slightly better than she had found them. And somehow, without ever trying to become the center of attention, she had become the person no one in the restaurant would forget. The last reservations of the evening slowly drifted toward the front entrance as the restaurant settled into the comfortable quiet that arrived after a successful dinner service. Candles flickered lower. Chairs were straightened one by one. The soft melody from the piano came to an end, leaving only the gentle sounds of dishes being washed somewhere beyond the kitchen doors. Claire Bennett finished wiping the final table in her section before carefully placing the folded linen napkins back into their wooden cabinet. For her, it had been an unusually long evening, but she approached the closing routine exactly as she approached everything else. Every glass aligned, every chair returned to its proper place, every detail completed before she considered her shift finished. Ethan Caldwell remained near the entrance instead of leaving with his executives. His driver had already sent 2 messages asking whether the car should continue waiting outside. Ethan ignored both. For years, he had measured every minute against the value of another meeting, another investment, another negotiation. Tonight, for reasons he could not fully explain, 5 more minutes seemed more valuable than another business appointment. He watched Claire thank each coworker before they left. One dishwasher waved goodnight. A hostess wished her mother a speedy recovery. Another server quietly handed Claire a small container of leftover soup, insisting she take it home instead of letting it go to waste. Claire accepted it with genuine gratitude, not embarrassment. Every exchange reflected the same quiet respect. It was obvious that kindness had become a habit rather than an effort. Ethan finally walked toward her. Claire looked up from arranging the last stack of menus. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," she said with the same calm professionalism she had shown all night. "I hope everything worked out." Ethan smiled faintly. "It did, because you chose not to stay silent." Claire gently folded the cleaning cloth in her hands before setting it aside. "I am glad the correction was useful." Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card. There was no dramatic gesture, no oversized promise. He placed it carefully on the counter between them. "I would like to offer you an opportunity." Claire glanced at the card but did not pick it up. "An opportunity? My company needs people who think the way you do." Ethan spoke slowly, choosing each word with unusual care. Not people who merely repeat what everyone else believes. People who notice what others overlook. I would like to invite you to visit our headquarters whenever your schedule allows. No interview. No pressure. Simply a conversation. Claire remained quiet for a few seconds. She looked at the card, then back at Ethan. That is very generous. Ethan shook his head gently. No. It is practical. Tonight you saved my company from an expensive mistake. It would be foolish for me not to ask. Claire smiled politely, but she still made no move toward the card. Ethan noticed. You are hesitant. A little. May I ask why? Claire answered honestly. Because I have learned that impressive opportunities sometimes arrive before life is ready to accept them. Ethan listened without interrupting. My mother still depends on me every morning before her nurse arrives. My shifts here help cover expenses that insurance does not. I cannot simply disappear because something exciting appears. Ethan nodded with genuine understanding. Months earlier, he might have interpreted those words as a lack of ambition. Tonight, he heard something entirely different. Responsibility. Then let me make something very clear, he replied. This is not an offer that expires tomorrow. Take a week. Take a month. Take a year if necessary. If the day ever comes when your circumstances change, my invitation will remain exactly where it is tonight. Claire finally reached for the card, holding it carefully between both hands rather than slipping it casually into her apron pocket. Thank you, she said softly. Not because of the opportunity, but because you are allowing me to choose the right time. Ethan smiled. Perhaps that is another lesson you quietly taught me this evening. The right people should never be rushed into the wrong moment. Claire looked at the card. Once more before placing it safely inside the small notebook she always carried for grocery lists, medication reminders, and work schedules. She treated it no differently than the rest of her responsibilities. Ethan realized that she valued promises more than appearances. As he turned toward the exit, he paused for one final glance across the now empty dining room. Only hours earlier he had entered believing he already knew how to recognize intelligence. He walked out understanding that wisdom often arrived wearing ordinary clothes, speaking softly enough to be ignored by anyone too busy listening only to themselves. 3 months passed quietly, carrying away the excitement of that remarkable evening until it became little more than a memory for most people who had witnessed it. The acquisition Ethan Caldwell had postponed was eventually completed under far better terms, saving his company far more than anyone had first estimated. Investors praised the decision. Business magazines described it as one of the most disciplined negotiations of the year. None of the articles mentioned the waitress whose quiet observation had changed everything before a single contract had been signed. Claire Bennett never expected them to. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Every morning, she helped her mother prepare for the day before driving across town to the restaurant. Every afternoon, she greeted new guests with the same warm smile. Every evening, she carefully folded aprons, polished silverware, and wished her co-workers a safe trip home. The business card Ethan had given her remained tucked safely inside the small notebook she carried everywhere. She never displayed it. She never mentioned it. She simply kept it there until the right season of her life might arrive. One crisp autumn afternoon, the restaurant welcomed an unexpected visitor. Ethan entered without an entourage, without assistance, and without announcing himself. He requested a quiet table by the window instead of the private conference room where they had first met. When Claire approached with a menu, she smiled exactly as she always had. "Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan returned the smile. "It is good to see you again, Claire." She poured him a cup of coffee before asking whether he would like his usual sparkling water. Ethan laughed softly. "You remembered." Claire nodded. People usually have favorite routines. Ethan looked around the dining room before speaking. "Have your circumstances changed?" Claire understood what he meant immediately. "A little." Her smile carried both relief and gratitude. "My mother's health has improved. She still needs me, but not every hour of the day." Ethan listened carefully. "Would you be willing to visit the office next Monday?" Claire looked through the window for a thoughtful moment before answering. Sunlight reflected across the sidewalk where families walked together carrying shopping bags and warm drinks. Life, she realized, had quietly opened a door she had not been able to enter before. She looked back at Ethan. "Yes," she said gently. "I think I am ready." Ethan smiled, but there was no sense of victory in his expression. Only respect. "Then we will simply talk." Nothing more. The following Monday, Claire arrived at the headquarters of Caldwell Capital wearing the same quiet confidence she had carried into the restaurant every day. She did not pretend to know everything. She did not try to impress anyone. She simply answered questions honestly, asked thoughtful ones in return, and solved several complex analytical problems with the same calm reasoning that had first caught Ethan's attention months earlier. Before the meeting ended, Ethan offered her a position designed around both her remarkable abilities and her responsibility to care for her mother. Flexible hours, continued medical leave whenever necessary, a team that valued thoughtful questions more than loud opinions. Claire accepted with sincere gratitude. Yet perhaps the greatest change did not appear on her employment contract. It appeared inside Ethan himself. Executives soon noticed that meetings became different. Junior analysts found it easier to speak when they spotted potential problems. Administrative assistants were invited to share observations during project reviews. Receptionists, interns, accountants, and support staff all discovered that their ideas were now welcomed instead of overlooked. Whenever someone asked Ethan why he insisted on hearing every voice before making an important decision, he would simply smile and say, "The smartest person in the room is not always sitting where you expect." Years later, people would remember Ethan Caldwell as a successful businessman who became an even stronger leader after learning to listen more carefully. They would remember Claire Bennett as a gifted analyst whose wisdom never outgrew her humility. And those who knew the full story never forgot the quiet lesson hidden inside an ordinary evening at a restaurant. True intelligence does not ask to be admired. True dignity does not demand to be recognized. They simply continue doing what is right until the world finally learns to pay attention.